All right, guys. I was hoping a few more people would show up, and I was hoping our TA Ian would show up, but that's not a big deal. So let's go ahead and get started. Hope everybody had a good spring break, had a good little reprieve from school, um, and I hope everybody did well in their midterm. We'll have those graded for you guys as soon as possible. This week we're going to talk about Chapter 8, the end of the 18th century, the 1790s, up through the War of 1812. We have any questions before we get started on the chapter? Okay, sounds good. Let's dive in. All right, so chapter 8 is titled Securing the Republic. And we're looking at this split now between Federalists and Anti-Federalists and how they're operating in the federal government. We talked about Alexander Hamilton a little bit a couple weeks ago, his impact on the Federalist Party. And under the Washington administration, he is the Secretary of Treasury. So he's important in the Federalist platform because of his economic policies. So we see that his economic policies are basically mapped out in his fiscal program, which looks to, or which tries to solve the financial crisis after the American Revolution. So the fiscal program, you need to understand, there's 5 main components of the fiscal program, and it's designed to sort of establish a national economic agenda where all of the states cooperate in one sort of national commerce or national economy. So the first component of the fiscal program is to pay off the national debt that was incurred during the independence movement, plus the debts of each individual state. So remember that each individual state had a separate economy prior to the revolution. And so to pay off all of the debts and to pay off individual state debts is a step in the direction of bringing these states under one concentrated economy. The second component is actually creating new national debt, replace old debt with interest accruing bonds, issued to the government's creditors. So this sort of falls in line with the Federalist belief that these affluent men of influence or the aristocracy should have a direct stake in the economic well-being of the country, right? So if we have wealthy individuals, merchants, and so forth invested in national debt, then they're going to be invested in the success of the national economy. So again, this is designed to bring together a national economic system. Another effort in that vein is to create the first Bank of the United States. This will become a very contentious issue, whether or not we should have a federal banking system or whether each individual state should be able to have their own banking system without any sort of central bank. It's very much modeled after the Bank of England. It is a private corporation. It's not a branch of the government, but it is capable of lending money to the government. So it's sort of inextricable from federal government economic policies. The fourth component is the whiskey tax. Americans at the end of the 18th century, or Americans throughout American history, are very people that are very supportive of alcohol. There's a great book written about this actually called The Alcoholic Republic that looks at the impact of alcohol on social, economic, and political processes in the United States. Really interesting book. But Hamilton knows that the best way, or one really good way to generate federal revenue, is taxing booze, taxing alcohol. And so the whiskey tax is designed to provide federal revenue to strengthen the federal government. And the fifth component is to increase domestic manufacturing. Again, one of the best ways to increase domestic manufacturing is to increase the costs for foreign companies to sell their products domestically or sell their products in the US. Governments do that through tariffs, right? Tariffs are taxes on imported goods. So in order to promote domestic manufacturing, a high tariff will discourage foreign companies from selling their products in the United States, which prompts American companies to be able to compete and have advantages in the open marketplace against foreign competitors. On top of that, Hamilton wants to provide direct government subsidies or government support to build factories, to continue industrialization. All right, so this is really where we start to see a split between the traditional anti-federalists and federalists. We start to see figureheads of American federal government, people like Madison and Thomas Jefferson, oppose Alexander Hamilton's fiscal program and split from the Federalists, supporting anti-federalists and sort of forming a new political party that we'll now refer to as Democratic Republicans. So just to make it more confusing, these anti-federalists adopt a new name, Democratic Republicans. Eventually, they sort of turn into Republicans after the War of 1812, and we'll talk about that at the end of class. So Jefferson becomes the figurehead of the Democratic Republicans. Hamilton, Washington, and Adams are really the figureheads of the Federalist Party. And it's really over arguments or the debate over Hamilton's fiscal program that these two sides start to align. Jefferson and Madison believe that Hamilton's fiscal program is an overreach of the federal government, that the federal government doesn't have authority to impose these economic restrictions and economic plans because of the limited powers granted to the federal government in the Constitution. So remember, this comes down to the 9th and 10th Amendments. We talked about this 2 weeks ago, that these amendments were put into the Bill of Rights to protect Americans' individual liberties. That if any powers not specifically granted in the Constitution should go to or should be retained by either the state or by the people, right? So states should be able to set some rules, and the people should retain some rights that aren't specifically granted to the federal government in the Constitution. So this is the first time Hamilton and the Federalists are really trying to challenge this notion and see if they can enact processes. I'm sorry, my dogs are seeing something out the window. See if they can pass bills and enact an economic agenda that isn't specifically granted to the government. So we see that Jefferson splits and starts to promote this, or continues to promote this idea that America's economy should really be an agrarian economy, sort of a republic of independent farmers, self-sufficient farmers who shouldn't be too involved in foreign entanglements, foreign economic alliances. And in that same respect, the federal government should have limited influence on the economy. Excuse me 1 second, guys. I'm gonna let my dogs out. All right, sorry about that, guys. Okay. So out of this split, we get this new political dichotomy, right? The Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans, who are formerly the Anti-Federalists and will be known after 1812 as Republicans. So then comes the bargain of 1790, where Jefferson, representing the Democratic Republicans, agrees to accept Hamilton's fiscal program if the Federalists will agree to house the capital between Maryland and Virginia, which at the time is considered the South. This is how we get the capital in Washington, D.C. The anti-federalists or Democratic Republicans hoped that this would increase their power in the federal government, Southerners' power in the federal government, since the seat of government would be in the South. On top of this, many of these Southern states, which by and large support Democratic Republicans, do not agree with Hamilton's fiscal program because many of them have already paid off their war debts. So they don't see the benefit of the federal government becoming involved in national debt or state debts because they see it as disproportionately benefiting the North over the South. All right, so this breaks down, or this comes down to a Federalist and Republican, Democratic Republican dichotomy. Let's talk about each of those parties. On one side, we have the Federalists. We've talked about them since the ratification debate, right, over the Constitution. They're mainly represented by Washington, John Adams, and Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton would have run for president in 1796 if it weren't for the case, or for the fact that he was born in the West Indies. So since he wasn't born on US soil, he wasn't eligible to run for president. The Federalists want to focus on trade and manufacturing. They want to be reliant on Great Britain as their most reliable trade partner. They want the British and the Americans to have a economic relationship to sort of go with their cultural ties. They're mainly represented by the economic and cultural elites of the United States, merchants and lawyers and established politicians and these aristocrats or this aristocracy. And they support a loose interpretation of the Constitution. This is an important point. Whereas Democratic Republicans support a strict interpretation of the Constitution, Federalists support a loose interpretation. What this means is that Federalists believe that any powers that aren't specifically or deny or forbidden to the federal government can be done. That anything that the Constitution doesn't specifically prohibit, that the federal government can usurp or can use those powers. Anti-Federalists or Democratic Republicans, on the other hand, have a strict interpretation of the Constitution. They believe that only powers specifically granted in the Constitution can be carried out by the federal government. Again, this comes down to powers and protections under the Bill of Rights. Okay, so the Anti-Federalists, Democratic Republicans, their figureheads are Thomas Jefferson, Madison. They believe in Jefferson's agrarian economic model, subsistence farming, self-reliance. They believe in a free market, that the government shouldn't intervene in market affairs. They believe in a laissez-faire economic system where the government doesn't interact or interfere with market prices or market conditions. And they have a very strict interpretation of the Constitution. Whereas the Federalists support an alliance with Great Britain as our main economic and eventually political ally, the Anti-Federalists or Democratic Republicans support an alliance with France. So that's another important difference between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. All right, make sure you guys read a little bit about the Whiskey Rebellion. Took place in Western Pennsylvania. This is over the whiskey tax that was imposed. Many Americans believe that the government shouldn't have the authority to tax certain products on a national scale. So in Western Pennsylvania, basically a group of farmers and distillers who are turning corn into whiskey and profiting off of the whiskey industry, rebel against tax collectors. There's a small skirmish in 1790. Actually, George Washington leads the federal government or the federal army, a 12,000-man militia into Pennsylvania to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. It's the only time a sitting president has actually led an army into battle. But this sort of illustrates this opposition to the authority of the government to tax a product on a national scale. This is directly hurting farmers who are turning their products into whiskey and selling it for profit. All right, on top of that, the Federalists really support certain limitations to democracy. You guys need to understand this. We talked about this a bit a couple weeks ago when we talked about the Electoral College, the indirect election of senators, which is the appointment of senators. We're going to talk here in a bit about the Alien Sedition Acts or significant infringement upon democracy or the democratic process. And so we have this odd sort of argument where the Federalists believe that the election process and the democratic process should be reserved to the elites, to people who they believe won't be influenced by trends. What they really want to do is limit the impact of immigrants' votes. And then the Democratic Republicans support expansions of democracy. They want to limit the federal government's power, and they want to support a more free form of democracy where more people can be involved in the political process. What's ironic about this is the Democratic Republicans are largely supported by Southerners. Well, we know that Southerners are largely trying to defend the institution of slavery. So it's ironic that they would say we want an expansion of democracy, we want more people to be involved in the democratic process, while they're still defending the institution of slavery, which has commodified people and removed them from not only the political process, but dehumanized them and really removed them from the societies or the political process in the South. We also talked about how they supported, Anti-Federalists supported the 3/5 law, or Southerners supported the 3/5 law so that Southern states could have more representation in Congress, while at the same time supporting this notion that democracy should be expanded, but of course, in their eyes, not to African Americans. All right, so then we get to the election of 1796. This is the first election we really see these organized political parties compete against each other in the election process. Prior to this, George Washington really stood for the presidency. He didn't really run for the presidency, right? We didn't see national divisions in politics or in these political dynamics between the North and the South until the election of 1796, because Washington really got so much support for his first two administrations. So in this election, we see that voting lines become almost entirely sectional, where we see that John Adams wins the majority of the North, and Thomas Jefferson wins the majority of the South. Remember, Jefferson is from Virginia. He's considered a Southerner. He supports agrarian economic systems, small farmers, and many of the platforms of the Democratic Republicans. So in this election, we see voting lines fall sectional. The North votes for Adams, the South votes for Jefferson, and Adams wins the presidency. At the time, the Constitution dictated that the man who got the second most votes became the vice president. So due to this technicality, Jefferson wins the second most amount of votes and becomes VP to Adams. So now we have two men in the executive that have conflicting political and economic ideologies, which makes it really difficult to get things done during the Adams presidency. All right, then you're going to read about the most important aspects of the Adams presidency. Most importantly, his efforts to restrict the democratic process to try to retain power for the Federalists. The best example of this is the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. So the Alien and Sedition Acts are designed to silence critics of the Federalists while also retaining political power for the Federalists by restricting who can be involved in the political process. Okay, so the first of it is the Naturalization Act, which extends the residency requirement for citizenship from 5 years to 14 years. So it takes more than twice as long to become a citizen and be able to vote. The second component is the Alien Act, which allows for the federal government to deport immigrants deemed dangerous to the American process. So this literally grants the federal government the authority to deport immigrants that they see as dangerous to their position of power. So people that are critical of the federal government, people that are organizing to support Democratic Republicans, immigrants that want their issues addressed by the federal government can now be silenced through the Sedition Act and deported through the Alien Act. So the last component is the Sedition Act. Sedition means disrupting public order. And basically, the Sedition Act allows the government to prosecute any public assembly or publication critical of the federal government. So this is exactly what the Anti-Federalists were afraid of during the ratification debate, right? Where they said that we don't want the federal government to be able to usurp power, to be able to strip liberties away from American citizens and take too much power. This is why the Bill of Rights was enacted. So it's very unpopular with the public. And in many ways, this is the Federalists' attempt to silence their critics and retain power in the executive branch. All right, while at the same time silencing those critics, right? All right, so Madison and Jefferson start to adopt resolutions and write in opposition to the Alien and Sedition Acts. Virginia and Kentucky legislatures adopt these resolutions, and they come to be known as the Virginia-Kentucky resolutions. It's basically declarations expressing their disagreement with and attacking the Sedition Act as unconstitutional. In these Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, they map out that this is the exact infringement of power that we were trying to protect against with the enactment of the Bill of Rights. The Alien and Sedition Acts were set to expire in 1801, just after the election of 1800, and this really gave Thomas Jefferson the political clout to win the election of 1800. So this gives Johnson political capital, right? It gives him something, an issue to bring to the people and show, look, these Federalists are trying to usurp power from the American people. They are passing acts that are unconstitutional. And as Adams' presidency wears on, the Alien Sedition Act really comes to hurt his public reputation, leading to Thomas Jefferson winning the election of 1800. All right, so we'll talk about the Jefferson presidency here in a bit. Make sure you guys read about slavery. Slavery after 1800, this is an important topic as well. We start to see that southern states, especially South Carolina, are already starting to threaten the federal government if they impede on the institution of slavery. So we've talked about how southern societies are slave societies, where slavery is central to the economic and social processes in the South. We also talked about how northern states have begun the process of abolition after the Revolution, that every state north of Maryland took steps to abolish slavery after the Revolution. They had to make concessions to the South, remember, keeping the Atlantic slave trade open until 1808. And so the South is very concerned with the federal government's authority to impede on or to end the institution of slavery. All right, so the book also talks about the Haitian Revolution, a very interesting episode of sort of Western Hemispheric colonial history. A man named Toussaint Louverture organizes a grassroots rebellion against their French colonizers from 1791 to 1804, eventually convinces the French that it's not worth it to continue to try to colonize this territory and subjugate these Haitian, indigenous Haitians and also Haitian slaves. That's going to have a major impact on some American rebellions. The most important one that the book talks about is Gabriel's Rebellion, which takes place in Virginia in 1800. And it's a very interesting example of these slaves trying to take the ideas of liberty and freedom and natural rights or unalienable rights and apply them to their own lives. Gabriel was an enslaved blacksmith who was inspired by Toussaint Louverture, but he was also inspired by this Republican rhetoric of anti-elitism, anti-aristocracy, pro-small farmer, extending liberties, extending the democratic process. What's ironic about that is many of these same Southern Democratic Republicans were supporting the institution of slavery and opposed the federal government, government's impeding on the institution of slavery. So they coordinated attacks on slave owners and Federalists. They very much reflected this sort of disillusionment with the American political system. Eventually, he has 1,000 supporters behind him. Unfortunately, he had some bad luck when weather becomes a factor. And the rebellion is basically put down by whites. And again, like many of these smaller rebellions that we've talked about, this will have more of an impact on future restrictions and tightening of slave codes than it would on the federal government's perception of slavery. All right, so let's get into, make sure you read about those slave codes. One of the most important is that it becomes illegal for Blacks to congregate without white supervision. This is important because the Black church is becoming a very important element of African-American cultural development. And so this is a way to try to hurt these centers of cultural development. It also makes it illegal for masters to free their slaves after a certain indentured servitude. And in Virginia specifically, slaves, these are all applied to Virginia specifically, slaves are required to, any free slave is required to leave Virginia after 1806. It also becomes illegal to teach slaves how to read. This is an interesting aspect of these repercussions of Gabriel's Rebellion, because prior to this, many whites supported teaching their slaves to read so that they could indoctrinate them in the Bible. Now, because of these rebellions and because of the availability of information, they're worried that slaves will read about other rebellions and be inspired to create their own rebellions. This is very much what happened with Toussaint Louverture, inspiring Gabriel to rebel in Virginia. Okay, so let's talk about the Jefferson presidency. Takes office in 1800. Wins the presidency in 1800. Believes in free market economics, laissez-faire economics, reducing the size of the federal government, right? These anti-federalists who are now Democratic Republicans want limited authority to the federal government. And in the same vein as that, they want to limit the size of people employed by the federal government, limit the amount of federal agencies and their influence on economics and politics and society in general. They don't believe in national taxes. They abolish all federal taxes except for the tariff. This is interesting because the South is still benefiting from these tariffs. They don't want foreign farmers and foreign companies to negatively impact or to restrict the economic growth of Southern companies and Southern farmers. And so it's all about a smaller government, right? This agrarian society that Thomas Jefferson has been promoting really since his opposition to Hamilton's fiscal program. What's ironic about this is then Thomas Jefferson proceeds to carry out the largest land purchase in the history of America, right? This is one of Jefferson's many hypocrisies. He believes in a limited federal government, but then carries out this huge territory buy from the French, which more than doubles the size of the United States. So make sure you guys read about the Louisiana Purchase. It's a bit complicated. This also comes down to these geopolitical power dynamics, or these imperial power dynamics in Europe. These territories in the Caribbean and in North America are being exchanged between these empires. This is very much part of the Napoleonic Wars. At first, Jefferson really just wants to purchase Louisiana because it's a really important port. What would now be, I'm sorry, New Orleans, which is a very important port in the Gulf of Mexico. But France really doesn't want to deal with these imperial colonies in North America that have become increasingly problematic, right? Remember, the French are the ones that are ousted from Haiti. There's several of these revolutions taking on. The French themselves are dealing with revolutions at the end of the 18th century. And so it's easier for them to sell this territory and sort of get out of North America, which Thomas Jefferson takes advantage of. So in May of 1803, for $15 million, he more than doubles the territory of the United States. Eventually, this would create 15 new states in these territories, and the first of which would be Louisiana. So, like I said, this is sort of a contradiction for Thomas Jefferson, who believes that the federal government should have limited powers, shouldn't be entangled with foreign alliances, shouldn't be involved in foreign treaties, and at the same time, he orchestrates the largest land purchase in the history of the United States. All right, so then we get into the War of 1812. Let me make sure I didn't miss anything in the book before we move on to the War of 1812. You'll read about the Lewis and Clark expedition after the Louisiana Purchase. Interesting sort of history of this manifest destiny process where Lewis and Clark are dispatched to explore the territories, these new territories that were purchased from the French. They rely on Native American trackers and Native American sort of guides. We also want to establish trade relations with Native Americans across what will be the Midwest and into what will be the Oregon and Washington territories. Make sure you guys understand that. Another example of Thomas Jefferson becoming involved in foreign affairs is the Barbary Wars. You guys won't be tested on the Barbary Wars, but it's an interesting history of the United States becoming involved in foreign affairs. All right, and then we get to the Madison presidency. Remember, Madison is the other figurehead of the Democratic Republicans. And Madison, in many ways, is sort of a disciple of Thomas Jefferson, supports many of the same policies and agendas of Thomas Jefferson. And when he takes office, this rivalry or this conflict with Great Britain is really going to become very heightened during his presidency. And this will lead to what becomes known as the War of 1812, which many people really believe or consider to be sort of a second American Revolution. Even though the British lost the first American Revolution, they've never felt like America, the United States, is truly an autonomous country that they can't influence and that they can't really manipulate and exploit for their own benefits. This worked during the Federalist administrations of Washington and Adams, because remember, the Federalists support economic and political alliances with the British. Well, when Jefferson takes office, the Democratic Republicans support alliances with France, which leads to the Louisiana Purchase, and relations and conditions between the US and Great Britain become increasingly distressed, become increasingly problematic. So really, the War of 1812 is about maritime rights and Great Britain trying to impose its authority on the Western Hemisphere, even though the United States is an autonomous political entity at this point. So the maritime rights start with the British trying to restrict trade or block trade between the US and the French. Remember, they want the US to basically be their economic partner, what really be their sort of little brother that they can exploit the US economy for their own benefit. And this also comes down to the Napoleonic Wars, where the British want to restrict US trading in the Caribbean with the French, US trading directly with the French, because they want to hurt Napoleon during these Napoleonic Wars. Remember, the French and the British are still in an imperial rivalry over power dynamics in Europe. So this leads to the Jay Treaty of 1794, which is under the Washington presidency and supports or gives the US priority trading with the British. So these pro-British Federalists support it and pro-French Republicans oppose it. So this creates tensions not only between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, but also between the US and Great Britain once Democratic Republicans take office in the Jefferson and Madison administrations. To ramp up these tensions in the beginning of the 19th century, the British are also practicing what is known as impressment, where they're basically abducting and forcing US merchant ships to fight for the British in these Napoleonic Wars. So they do this by attacking US merchant ships who are trading with the French, impressing those US merchants into military service for the British. This is known as impressment. Make sure you guys understand that. Okay, guys, I'm going to end there because you've got 3 really good sources on the War of 1812. That's going to be your source assignment for this week. Make sure you read those 3 articles and get ready for your source assignment. I'll give you guys a few main points you need to understand. Make sure you understand who supports the war and who opposes it, what we would call hawks and doves. Out of this, you're going to have new political dichotomies after the War of 1812. The Federalists, who really support the British, who are our enemies in the War of 1812, cease to exist after the war. Spoiler alert, we win the War of 1812, and so the Federalists are cast as sort of traitors of the American people because they supported the enemy during the war. So make sure you understand the dichotomy between who supports the war, the hawks, who opposes the war, the doves, and also which side each political party supports, right? The Federalists still want to maintain a relationship with Great Britain, whereas the Democratic Republicans see them as traitors to the United States for supporting our enemy in the War of 1812. You guys will also read about the sort of Midwest arena of the War of 1812, where Native Americans become very important. In the process, you'll read about Tecumseh and Tensikawa, what's called the Northwestern, the Midwestern Front, conflicting narratives of the war. That's important. Was this a war of territorial expansion? Was this defense of American honor? Is this really a second revolution? Many historians see this as sort of a culmination of the American Revolution, where we really show that Great Britain can't dictate American national economic policies or dictate our economy on a national level. The impact of the Napoleonic Wars on the War of 1812. This is much like the Revolution. England has so many conflicts going on that it's really going to impact how they function in the war. Make sure you understand the Native Americans' role in the process. And then you'll also read about the Battle of New Orleans, which actually takes place after the war is over, after the Treaty of Ghent was signed, and shows the need for an improved communication infrastructure and transportation infrastructure in the United States. This is where Andrew Jackson really becomes a military celebrity, which he'll use as capital to become a political celebrity, eventually a state politician, and eventually the president. So make sure you guys read about the Battle of New Orleans. Make sure you read about his war against the Red Stick Creeks in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. We'll talk significantly about Andrew Jackson and classes to come. The Treaty of Ghent ends the War of 1812. And this, after Napoleon falls, the Treaty of Ghent is signed. This really sort of ushers in a period of unprecedented peace in Europe, which is important for the United States because at the beginning of the 19th century, we can really focus on domestic issues. We can focus on market and transportation and communications infrastructures, which really leads into the market revolution or the industrial revolution of the 19th century. All right, guys, and then next week we'll start talking about the market revolution and the Age of Jackson. Any questions for me, guys? All right, sounds good. Well, thanks for coming, guys. We'll see y'all next week. Have a good week. If you guys have any issues with your assignments or sources or anything, shoot me an email.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.